Going to my own speech, you remember last time I promised that I would address two issues. During the State of the Nation address, I told you that today, as part of the budget speech, I would address two issues. And these are the East African Federation and corruption. I will do exactly that. However, I will dissect the corruption into two. First of all, corruption for getting money through crooked ways as one type of corruption, and political corruption through the use of money to get political support, not based on principles or policies. Politics is about principles and policies. That's what you should be telling the public to choose from. My policy is this, his policy is that, you the public, you choose. But when you bring in money, you are polluting the Chiriza. Let me start with the more important question of the political federation of East Africa and possible other federations in other parts of Africa. This was a goal pursued by our ancestors, starting with the Pan-Africanist pioneers among the black people in the United States of America. These were W.B. Du Bois, George Padmore, Marcus Garvey, Sylvester Williams, and others. By the mid-1900s, new actors had come on the scene in the persons of Jomo Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Sekou Toure of Guinea, Modibo Keita, and others. But if you go back, you will find that by 1900, the whole of Africa had shamefully been colonized because our egocentric and incompetent kings had failed to defend us, and instead we are busy fighting fratricide wars among us. At that time, when we were colonized, the slogan for survival was, in quotes, Uhuru na Umoja, independence and unity. That's what we were saying. We unite, we fight for freedom, independence, and then after we unite to get strength. That was the slogan. Starting with 1912, the Africans in South Africa took the initiative and started a new anti-colonial force, the African National Congress of South Africa. And you should know that even Mahatma Gandhi of India was also in India, in South Africa at this time, so he was part of this effort. At the beginning of the new African resistance, led by more informed people. Our resistance was assisted by two factors that came on the scene during that century. These were, number one, the emergence of the socialist camps of nations in the form of the Soviet Union in 1917, China in 1949, and others. These huge countries were taken over by people who did not believe in colonialism. These were the communists. So this was a new factor. As we were fighting for our freedom, this new factor came on the scene. And the second factor were the fratricidal wars, fratricidal inter-imperialist wars of 1914 to 1918 and 1939 to 1945 among the imperialists. The imperialists were now fighting over us. Who will control which one? You know, those imperialists had divided us up, shared us like a cake because of our incompetent kings here. Came, sat in Berlin, this is for you, this is for you, this is for you. Then there was a new country called Germany, which had become united a short while before that. They wanted to start a war. So you are cheating us. We also want a share with the colonies. Then they said, please don't start a war, Bismarck, please. Let's give you some of the properties. You take Tanganyika, Rwanda, Burundi, Namibia, Cameroon, and so on. But by the end of the century, Germany was saying, you have cheated me. I also need more slaves. I need more colonies. That's how their war started, fighting over us. These two factors, on the one hand, meant that the worldwide anti-colonial movement, including the African anti-colonial movement, could receive solidarity from those socialist countries. And on the other hand, the imperialist countries had weakened themselves in the process of their greed for world domination. So as they were fighting over us, fortunately they weakened themselves, which was good for us. The worldwide anti-colonial movement, on account of these three factors, the three factors are our resistance, number one, number two, the emergence of the socialist countries which were supporting us, and number three, the mutual weakening of the imperialists among themselves. The worldwide anti-colonial movement, on account of these three factors, started scoring strategic victories with the independence of India in 1947, Indonesia in 1945, the defeat of the Kuomintang traitors in China, 1949, etc. Amazingly, the imperialists tried in many cases to maintain colonial control even after these catastrophes. The French tried to recognize Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos until the Vietnamese defeated them at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The French were defeated in Algeria. The British faced the Mau Mau armed resistance in Kenya and mass resistance throughout the whole of Africa. Here in Uganda, Ignatius Kanga Musazi led the mass resistance movement. I don't hear you, the political actors who are always on the radio, I don't hear you talking about I.K. Musazi, talking about nothing most of the time. Musazi played a very big role in our struggle. On account of this resistance, but this is also the weakness of the NRM Secretariat. They should do more sensitization. On account of these resistance efforts, by 1963, 36 African countries had achieved independence, uhuru, so we had achieved uhuru. It is these countries that founded the Organization of African Unity at Addis Ababa. There was, however, another almost 20 African countries that were still under colonial rule. The African Summit gave an ultimatum to the imperialists to give independence to the whole of Africa peacefully, or they would be ejected by force. People don't know this history. They just run around, but if you don't know this, you can make a lot of mistakes. So the OAU meeting in 1963 gave an ultimatum to the imperialists, said, get out of the whole of Africa peacefully, or we shall throw you out by force. The imperialists hot air. They never paid heed. However, the Africans were serious and able to defeat the imperialists by force. Indeed, by 1974, Samora Machel had defeated the Portuguese army of 70,000 in Mozambique. Amílcar Cabral and his colleagues had defeated the Portuguese army in Guinea-Bissau. Agostinho Neto had defeated the Portuguese army in Angola. By 1980, Robert Mugabe and Zangla, their army, had defeated Ian Smith in Zimbabwe. 1990, Namibia got independence, and in 1994, the African majority defeated the white racists in South Africa. 5 centuries of Africa's shame of the slave trade and colonialism should have ended then. This is where we need to really examine ourselves, because we achieved victory both by peaceful method and by war. So what happened? What happened? When you hear people on the radio talking, just talk, empty talk. What happened? Why did we people? This is not fiction. It is history. We defeated the imperialists by peaceful means, but also by war. So what happened? Exactly what happened? Five centuries of Africa's shame of the slave trade and colonialism should have ended then. we have achieved independence, uhuru in the whole of Africa. The question was, where was umoja? Because you remember the slogan was uhuru na umoja. Now by 1994, the whole of Africa had achieved uhuru. So what happened to the umoja? In the meantime, the question was, where was umoja, unity? In the meantime, we who were participants in much of this time had to diagnose the problem. In that process, we established the 3 historical missions and the 4 ideological principles. To establish the missions and the principles, we would start with a question. Question number 1 was, do the Africans need, deserve, and are they entitled to prosperity like other people in the world, or are they not so entitled? That's the question we would ask. Are the Africans entitled, and do they deserve prosperity like all the other people in the world? If the answer is yes, the next question would be, where does prosperity come from? Can prosperity sustainably come from begging? Because you remember the issue of aid. Can you get prosperity through aid? Our answer was no. Prosperity can only come from producing a good or a service, which is what Honorable Kasseji is saying, by being a wealth creator, producing a good or a service by an individual, a family, a company, etc., and selling it sustainably with HMRO. HMRO is the assessing the profitability. In that way, you will get income and solve your problems. That, however, raises another question. Who will sustainably buy our goods or our services reliably with predictability? So you can see what's happening in the world. The other time, you people, you said, well, we don't want our children to be homosexuals. Our children, we didn't say other people's children. We don't want our children to be homosexuals. Oh, and some of our friends who had given us market access took us off their AGOA list. Imagine. So, how can you rely on such a person for business? Today, you trade with him. Tomorrow, he stops you because of your internal policy, not even anything affecting him. So, the third question, who will sustainably buy our goods or services reliably and with predictability? When we studied the African tribes, including my own, the Banyankore-Bahororo, we discovered that intra-tribal trade is either limited or completely absent. Why? It is because these communities sometimes produce similar products. The Banyankore-Bahororo, for instance, all have milk, beef, bananas, etc. A does not buy from B and vice versa. Therefore, identity, being one tribe, does not necessarily solve the problem of prosperity. Happily, we discovered a ready solution, and this was Uganda, that multi-tribal unity, which was already there. You had the Banyankore-Bahororo there, but you also had other people. Even in the colonial times of the smaller enclave economy, the business complementarities among the tribes were already coming up. I was able to pay for education on account of two categories of actors. Category one was Amos Kaguta, my father, who had cattle he had inherited from his ancestors. Hence, those cattle were Enshugi, the cattle of Jaja, inherited from ancestors. You could therefore sell some of them and pay my school fees. The problem, however, was that there was neither a single Banyankore-Bahororo cattle trader at that time, nor was there a developed beef market in the area of Ntungamo. You know what Ntungamo is? You know what Ntungamo is, you people? You will not find it on the Uganda map, you will not find it. So in Ntungamo, we had neither traders of cattle, nor did we have a meat market at that time. That is how the second category of rescuers came in. The people who rescued me to go to school. These were two Baganda, one of them called Warusi Mpanga, and another one called Buchenya. Buchenya, the Banyankore called him Buchenya, but the Baganda would call him Bukenya. Now that of Kenya has a grandson who is a big fellow now in the government. I think he won the Equal Opportunities Commission. If that Munyankole Muganda is here, he can come and they see how Banyankole Baganda look like. Banyankole is in Baganda. If that boy here, if he's here, let him come and they see him here. And then there was also a white man, Share. Was a white man, Share. Warusindi was buying cattle for the Kampala beef market, Bukenya for the Mbara market, and Share for the Kinande copper mines workforce. So it was these three people who supported my education. Warusindi would buy the cows to bring them to Kampala. Bukenya would take them to the small Mbara market. Share would take the cows to the market. Even at that time, the complementarity among the tribes was becoming clear. But even in the pre-colonial times, the interzones trade had become clear. Textiles in Nyanda were coming from the coast in Zanzibar. The glass beads in Kwanzi were from the same source, and so were the guns. Ivory, Enino, however, was coming from the interior of the African continent, and so were the salt, the backcloth, the hulls, etc. It is this historical mission of the need for prosperity that led us to discover the first ideological principle of our movement, of the NRM. As the minister was saying, patriotism, love Uganda. Why? It is because you need it for your prosperity as a market, among other advantages. However, learning from the history of other countries and also seeing what is happening in Uganda once it settled down and started recovery, we discovered that the internal market is not enough. As we speak today, Uganda has got surplus of milk, maize, bananas, beef, sugar, cement, steel products of certain types, etc., as the minister was telling you here. Where do we sell all these? This is when the NRM asked the Ugandans the following questions. Number one, have you heard of East Africa? Because you are stuck with your products. Have you heard of East Africa? Because you are busy with the tribes. Some people are telling you, we, as Banyankole, we, as Baganda, we, as Acholi, some of those fellows are busy telling you about the tribes. If you are Abasoga really, we are this one. But why don't we solve if those are enough, why do we have a problem of surplus milk, surplus sugar, surplus this? And this is why the NRM said, have you heard of East Africa? Have you heard of Africa? Why don't you check whether they can buy what we produce and also buy what they produce? Indeed, as I speak now, East Africa and Africa are already buying parts of our surpluses. Otherwise, these sectors of the economy would have collapsed by now. That is how the NRM identified the second ideological principle of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism. Love Africa. Why? It is because we need it for our prosperity. This realization of the need for bigger markets was not only clear to the NRM, Others before us had realized this. Germany was not one country until 1871. Germanic-speaking people were divided into 39 kingdoms of Prussia, Saxony, Bavaria, etc. However, there was a strong business group in Prussia known as Junkers. It is written Junkers, but they pronounce it Junkers, that saw the importance of a united German market. Working with Bismarck, they pushed the Pan-Germanism agenda, the unity of the Germans. France, by 1789, had been a united kingdom for a long time. There were, however, internal taxes between the provinces of France known as Gabelle. Those provinces were fiefdoms of the princes of those areas. The rising French middle class, the bourgeoisie, could not accept this. Indeed, the removal of these internal taxes were part of the grievances of the French Revolution. On these two ideological principles of patriotism and Pan-Africanism, we added socio-economic transformation and democracy. This was all to achieve historical mission number 1, prosperity for the African people through market integration. We are glad by 1980, the African leaders had started seeing the importance of market integration as part of the Lagos Plan of Action. When the NRM took power, we worked with the Wazee, Museveni, Mzee Mkapa, and Mzee Moi to revive the East African community that was relaunched on the 30th of November 1999. The East African community has now expanded to incorporate Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, DRC, and Somalia. In addition, we have got COMESA and the CFTA, the Continental Free Trade Area. We need to remove all the trade barriers and develop infrastructure to facilitate this trade. However, we also need to ensure that countries that are beginning to come up are assisted. We don't want a common market where some countries benefit, others lose. No, it's very dangerous. The countries which are coming up must be assisted so they also trade equitably. We should never allow trade imbalances among member states to persist. This market integration will address the historical mission of prosperity. However, we had also identified the second historical mission as that of strategic security. How can Africa ensure that never again will its people be threatened by anybody having gone through the 5 centuries of the slave trade, colonialism, and neocolonialism? Economic integration, if it is fully implemented, will address the issue of prosperity. However, during the Second World War, the developed countries of Holland, Belgium, Denmark, France, Norway, etc. became victims of German aggression. They are being developed notwithstanding. It was the Soviet Union and later the USA and UK that defeated the Hellenic Hitler. Even we, the Africans, 500,000 of Africans took part in that war, as did 2.5 million Indians who took part in that war to save those those countries, France and Holland and all that. The highly developed Israel, in terms of technology, would find it difficult to survive in that zone without the cover of the United States of America. Some actors in the world talk of achieving superiority in the 4 dimensions: land forces, air forces, at sea, the Navy, and in space. Where does this leave Africa? Are we going to exist or not exist with the permission of others? Are we only to thrive with the permission of others? Coming to multidimensional strategic security, only 4 countries have been to the moon. These are USA, Russia, China, and India recently. Can Uganda manage a serious space program, even when it becomes the first world country? As we tried to answer that question, there was already an answer given by our elders before independence. This was Uhuru na Umoja, freedom and unity. The present weaknesses in Africa are partly due to the mistake of arrivism, where the leaders prefer to remain big fishes in small ponds. It was only Mwalimu Nyerere of Tanganyika and Mzee Karume of Zanzibar that consummated the economic and political integration of the 2 countries to create Tanzania that has been a great success. Recently, the Union of Tanzania celebrated 60 years. We congratulate our brothers and sisters of Tanzania. Economic and political integration where possible are the correct answer to the question of prosperity and strategic security. It handles the 2 missions. In 1963, we were about to achieve the political federation of East Africa. There is a picture which I will give some of the, you can see it there. That picture. I have that picture. I will give it to a few people after my speech. But that was 1963, Uganda, August. They were saying federation this year, federation of East Africa this year. That's what they were saying. Thank you. You can see the declaration, that declaration by our leaders. However, along the way, some of them developed cold feet. That is why Mwalimu Nyerere and Mzee Karume must be hailed as some of the most devoted Africans that have ever lived. You can be sure that if that federation had taken off, so many of the problems that afflicted us could have been avoided. Certainly, Amin would never have taken power in Uganda. If that federation was there, Idi Amin would never have taken power in Uganda here. Maybe the problems of Rwanda and Burundi could have been handled differently. The problems in South Sudan and Somalia could possibly have been handled differently, as would have been the problems of Congo. Why do I say this? Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, under one political authority, would have been so strong that their voice in these matters would have been decisive. I remember, for instance, our leaders then took a stand on the issue of Congo in 1965. Soon, however, the states started taking divergent positions, which would not have been the case if they were under one political authority. We must again salute Mwalimu Nyerere and Tanzania, because without the support of much of Africa, except for Zambia, Botswana, Algeria, Nasser's Egypt, and Guinea-Conakry, They were able to be a reliable rear base for the anti-colonial armed struggle that raged in Southern Africa from 1962 to 1994 when South Africa achieved freedom. It is a pity that after victory we only got Uhuru, independence, and not Umoja, unity, especially political integration. The third historical mission we identified was the Undugu Brotherhood of the 1.5 billion African people. These people belong to only 4 linguistic groups: the Niger Congo, the Bantus and the Kwa, the Nilo-Saharan, the Nilotics, the Cushitic and the Sudanic, the Afro-Asiatic, Arabic, Amharic and Tigrinya, and the Khoisan, the group in South Africa. Recently, I had a delegation from Congo, but we did not have a French translator. However, there was a Rutoro speaker from Ituri province in Congo, Tebasima Ateyi. I therefore spoke in Rutoro, and he translated to the rest in French. This was just like 2 weeks ago when I had a group from Congo. I was speaking in Rutoro, and he was translating to those people in French. Apart from similar Interakistian, Bantu, and Nilotic dialects, we have the good luck of Swahili, which is a neutral, non-tribal dialect developed by our ancestors when they met at the East African coast to conduct business. Therefore, the third historical mission is a question. In quotes, why can't the responsible political actors use the Undugu, the brotherhood, similarities or linkages of these people to create units that support the other 2 historical missions of prosperity and strategic security? You don't hear anybody talking, this is political class, talking about, I don't know what they talk about on TV. I remember once in a while to watch, talking nothing. How can you have a political class lost? Because when we were young, we were very much involved. Whatever happened in the whole of Africa, we were involved. In 1968, I went to Mozambique to the liberated zone with some other students. I was not a Mozambican. Baleka ndamira Sunday Kola, niboko niweta Sunday Kola, namazima tigari mugo. Anyana avunile kyo bannange. They left undone what they ought to have done. They left undone what they ought to have done. They did what they ought not to have done, and there is no truth in them. That's what it says in English. With these 3 historical missions and the 4 ideological principles, we are able to shape our strategy vis-à-vis Africa. The movement, when we talk of movement, we are talking about the 3 historical missions and 4 ideological principles. Not about me. You are not important. Elect me. Elect you for what? Because you are handsome, because you are what? What medicine do you have for us? What medicine do you have for us? We need a medicine for our problems. With these 3 historical missions and the 4 ideological principles, we were able to shape our strategy vis-à-vis Africa. Whatever we did was guided by this. Why did we tactically work with Obote? But when Amin came, we decided to fight him. Because we saw what we were trying to see, how we can move him, beg him, see how to move him to our program. But Amin was off the point. So we said, kwenda, talk. You cannot interfere with our destiny. We have a journey. We are on a journey. You stood in front of us to Noktoa. But the strategy that we always commend, this strategy we always commend to our supporters, is to work for economic integration of the whole of Africa, so as to support prosperity of the African people and support the additional political integration in the parts of Africa where it is feasible by creating political federations such as the Political Federation of East Africa. Mwalimu Nyerere and ourselves diverged a bit from Mzee Nkrumah and Muammar Gaddafi, who are talking of a continental government of the whole of Africa. We do not think that such a target of a continental government of the whole of Africa was either feasible or even desirable, because the whole of Africa does not possess enough similarities and linkages to be cohesive, a necessary prerequisite for political integration. East Africa is, and with the use of Swahili, can be very cohesive. The whole of Africa should be one common market. Apart from the major Congo linguistic group that has got a lot of similarities, there are also linkages with, for instance, the Nilo-Saharan groups of languages. This is how, amazingly, I discovered that the Somali word for cow is Saa. It is the very word that most of the Bantu dialects in the Great Lakes use to describe the cow dung, not any other dung. So what the Somalis call a cow is what we call cow dung here. But you can see the linkage. There are a lot of linkages with the Nilotic dialects that we do not have to go into here. It is this belief in the three historical principles and four ideological, three historical missions and four ideological principles that enabled the student movement of the 1960s to metamorphose into the armed Fromasa that fought Amin and eventually the NRA-NRM. We rejected the sectarian politics of identity of religion, tribes, and gender chauvinism. By 1986, by the force of 20,000 NRA fighters, backed by millions of civilians that were only propelled by conviction, not by any mercenary interests. The majority of the NRA UPDF have maintained this. That is why between 1971 and 2021, the NRA UPDF was fighting for no pay or low pay. Owing to death of some of our supporters, for national causes mainly, we started getting some corrupt elements, but a minority. These are a minority and are easier to identify and isolate. The spirit of voluntarism was also strong among the civilians. That is why the National Resistance Council, for instance, were getting a low salary, but we were content. When we came to the Constituent Assembly, we improved the pay, knowing that it was a temporary parliament. However, subsequent parliaments made two mistakes. One was to increase their salary and allowances, thereby departing from the spirit of sacrifice that had been the hallmark of the NRA, UPDF, NRM. Secondly, a group known as YPA, Young Parliamentarians Association, opportunistically and for cheap popularity, started going around the country and conducting fundraising for some cheap popularity projects, such as schools, etc. I warned them, but they could not listen. I did not want to precipitate a crisis with them when we had problems of Rwanda, Congo, South Sudan, etc. This is, however, why I rejected the call to raise the pay of the president. I said the president will never get a high salary as long as I'm in government and as long as the economy is still growing. Comrades, it's now time to see how to correct these two mistakes. This is because it led the population to believe that the political leaders have a lot of money and share it with the voters in the form of bribes and endless fundraisings. Although the MPs gave themselves a lot of money, it is not enough to meet these indisciplined demands for bribes and fundraisings. Hence they end up with debts and some have run from the constituencies. I hear some of them are IDPs. Internally displaced persons. The government, through the budgets, is the one that can help the people to solve their problems. Programs like NADS, Operation Wealth Creation, PDM, and Yoga, etc., have already shown that they can liberate people from poverty. You can see it. You can see it. There's a man from Kamwenge. If you can show me that Kamwenge man, you people in my group, the man in Kamwenge